When I was a child, my grandmother often told me stories. Stories that she swore were true, though they sounded like something out of a dream or a nightmare. There was one of her favourites. She would only tell it on winter nights. She would sit me down, the wind howling outside, and recount tales passed down through our family. Here's another story that particularly stayed with me. It's about a man that she claimed was her great uncle, a distant relative whose life was forever changed by an encounter with the Yuki-Onna, the snow woman. She began the story like this. Many years ago, long before you were born, my great uncle Minokichi lived in a small village tucked deep into the mountains. Now, winters in those mountains were harsh, with snow so thick it buried homes, and winds so cold they could freeze your breath in midair. Despite the unforgiving weather, people like Minokichi made their living from the forest, cutting wood to sell in the villages below. Now, my great uncle Minokichi, he was young at the time, just about 17, and he worked alongside his master, an older man who had taken him in as an apprentice. They often journeyed into the mountains together, staying overnight when the work took too long to finish before dark. One winter day, just as they were preparing to return home, a blizzard swept in with frightening, unnatural speed. Snow fell in thick sheets, blinding them to the trail. The master, experienced as he was, realized they wouldn't make it back alive, and led Minokichi to an old hut he knew of nearby, trying to just stay out of the snow and the chilling, deadly cold. It wasn't much, just 4 walls on a roof, but it would keep the worst of the storm at bay. They built a small fire, ate what little food they had, and huddled together for warmth. The wind howled like a pack of wolves outside, shaking the wooden walls. Uncle Minokichi felt the chill seep into his bones, but exhaustion eventually overtook him and he fell asleep. What happened next? This is something my grandma said that Uncle Minokichi could never explain without trembling. He woke suddenly to a strange stillness in the air, as if even the wind had held its breath. The fire had gone out and the hut was plunged into darkness. At first he thought he was dreaming, but there, a woman stood inside the hut, though he hadn't heard the door open, and now it stood shut. She was unlike anyone he'd ever seen, tall with long black hair, and skin so pale it seemed to glow in the dark. Her kimono was pure white, blending with the snow that had crept in through the cracks of the hut. She bent over the master, her breath forming a white mist that enveloped him. The old man's face turned as pale as hers, frost creeping across his skin. Uncle Minokichi wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then, the woman turned to him, her eyes dark and piercing, locked onto his. "You are young and handsome," she said, her voice soft but cold enough to freeze the air around her. "I will let you live, but only if you swear never to speak of what you've seen. If you do, I will return, and you will not escape me." The young Minokichi nodded, too terrified to do anything else. The woman gave him one last look before vanishing into the storm, leaving no trace of her presence except the frozen, dead body of the master. When the storm passed the next morning, villagers found Uncle Minokichi alone in the hut, shivering and pale but somehow still alive. The master was buried that same week, and Uncle Minokichi carried the weight of his secret in silence. Years passed, and Uncle Minokichi grew into a man. He eventually met a beautiful woman named Oyuki. My grandma always said she was the most stunning woman anyone had ever seen. She actually met her, with skin as pale as snow and hair as black as midnight. No one in the village knew where she'd come from, but Uncle Minokichi didn't care. He fell in love with her instantly. Now this might be a good time to tell you that Yuki or Oyuki in Japanese means snow. They married and Oyuki became part of the family, part of my family. My grandmother said that everyone loved her. She was kind, gentle, and devoted to Uncle Minokichi. They had several children together and lived a happy, peaceful life, at least for a time. But one night, as the couple sat together by the fire, something changed. The children were asleep. The house was quiet except for the crackling of the flames. Perhaps it was the comfort of the moment or the years that had dulled his fear. But Uncle Minokichi found himself telling his wife Oyuki about the night he and his master had been caught in the blizzard. He spoke of the strange woman who had appeared in the hut, her breath like frost, and the warning she'd given him. As he finished, the room immediately grew colder. The fire crackled and burned brightly, yet no heat came from it. Uncle Minokichi looked up to see Oyuki staring at him, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she floated to her feet, and he heard a voice that he recognized, even though he hadn't heard it in years. "You promised never to speak of that night," she said, her voice trembling with anger. Her features began to change. Her soft smile vanished, replaced by the icy gaze of the snow woman. Minokichi's heart stopped. "It was I who spared you that night," she continued, her voice growing colder with each word. "Had you kept your promise, we could have lived in peace, happily. But now..." She stopped, glancing toward the room where their children slept. "For their sake, I will not take your life," she said at last. "But remember this, Minokichi. You betrayed me. 2 times I have spared your life. There will not be a third." With those words, the wife he'd been married to for years, the wife that bore and raised his children, she dissolved into an icy cloud of mist, leaving Minokichi alone by the fire. My grandmother always said that Minokichi never remarried and raised his children on his own from there, and he never spoke of Oyuki again. But on cold winter nights when the snow fell thick and the wind howled, he would sit by the fire with a distant look in his eyes, as if waiting for her to return. And sometimes, my grandmother would whisper, leaning in close, he claimed he could feel her watching him, just beyond the edge of the forest, her breath turning the air to frost. I don't know if that story's true or not, but believe me, when my grandma told me, I believed every word. And on nights like this, when the snow falls and the world turns quiet, I can't help but wonder if the Yuki-Onna is still out there, waiting for someone else to break their promise.